This is our Right Voices interview series where we talk to leaders in the free market environmental movement. And today we're honored to be joined by a very special guest, U.S. Representative Bruce Westerman. And before getting into politics, this is really interesting. Congressman Westerman actually works as a forester. So he has firsthand knowledge in the space that frankly puts him in the rarefied air among policymakers. Congressman Westerman now represents Arkansas's 4th Congressional District, and he's the ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee. Congressman, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
John, good to be with you. Good afternoon. I look forward to the discussion. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about trees today.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I think as you and I we met and talked at a meeting a few months ago, and I've got a 62-acre farm about an hour outside of DC and just planted over 1,000 trees. So it's really an honor and privilege to talk to somebody who's been in the field and knows the area of natural solutions really inside and out, and is the leader in the House of Representatives on that. So, Congressman, why don't let's talk about really your vision, and let's talk about what might happen, in 2022. Republicans have a good chance of taking the House, and if that happens, you would be in line to become the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. What would you do if you had the gavel? What would your first priorities be as chairman, if you have that privilege?
Well, John, first off, thank you for doing your part, planting that many trees. You're probably doing a lot more than the upper quartile of Americans to do something that actually combats carbon in the atmosphere. So that's a good proactive solution.
Well, thank you.
And as chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, my focus would really be on conservation. And that's a broad word. It simply means being a good steward of the resources that we have. It means using those resources in a responsible manner and leaving what we have in better shape for future generations. And I think the data tells that a free market approach to conservation is the best way to go. That we have this abundance of resources in the U.S. That can be beneficial for the environment, be beneficial for the economy, especially in rural areas. But you have to let those market factors work, and you have to have access to those resources. Now, we think of access as recreation, which is extremely important. And it looks like, I know in my district, I see things that tend to limit access for recreation, but across the country, we're seeing a limited access on federal lands to developing the resources that we need to have a strong economy and a healthy environment. There's a huge demand for critical minerals, but there's also been a huge push not to develop those critical minerals on our federal lands. There's so much that we deal with on the Natural Resources Committee, but in a broad sense, I want to look at it through that lens of conservation and being good stewards of what we have, growing the economy and making the environment healthy at the same time.
Yeah, Congressman, you mentioned free markets. As I'm sure you've seen, as we put a study out written by Nick Loris, who we had the privilege of hiring from the Heritage Foundation. But Nick did a fantastic paper called Free Economies or Clean Economies, where he did a survey and overlaid the Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom and the Yale Environmental Performance Index. And what we found is that the freer economies are actually twice as clean as less free. And so in your response, when you describe our natural environment, our economic environment, I think one of the mistakes the left makes is that they forget, they talk about being good on science, but they're really bad on math. And they're actually not that great on science either. We can talk about that some, but you've got to be good on both. And I think to your point is that if you want to be a conservationist, the economy and the environment go hand in hand. And one of those initiatives,
not mutually exclusive. Some people
right.
want to say you can either have a healthy environment or a strong economy, but you can't have both. But like the paper you're talking about, it's a great book that was written by the folks out at PERC on free market environmentalism. In all areas of natural resources, including hunting and fishing, you can see examples of when you let market forces work, it's actually better for the environment. It's better for air quality, water quality, for plant and animal biodiversity. but you've got to let those forces work. And it's intuitive. You go to the poorest parts of the world and you see the worst environmental stewardship. And you go to the more developed parts of the world and you see more emphasis on environmental stewardship. And most of the time, folks are doing a better job.
Right. Yeah, and you've been a leader on obviously the Trillion Trees Initiative. Talk a little bit about that, and particularly, I've looked too at how the financing of that would work. I think it's an interesting aspect of that legislation of how you propose and envision a partnership between the public sector, private sector. Describe just broadly what your legislation would do, and then how it could be implemented in a way that would be fiscally responsible and good for the natural and economic environment of our country.
Yeah, John, if you look at the political side of trees, you meet very many people who dislike trees. And actually, if you look at literature and art throughout history, it's always the villain that's opposed to trees. So trees are the thing that can bring people together. And left, right, independent, everybody seems to like the idea of trees. And trees are by far the most proactive, pragmatic, large-scale, most economical thing we can do to combat carbon in the atmosphere. Trees are the carbon eater. Teddy Roosevelt explained it best when he said trees are the lungs of the earth. They breathe in carbon dioxide, they breathe out oxygen. We know that all about photosynthesis. Cool thing about trees is when they bring that carbon dioxide in and convert it to different hydrocarbons, they store that in the wood for as long as that wood is intact. So when you use wood in buildings, you're creating like a carbon battery. And if you do sustainable forestry, where you're always growing more than you harvest, then you're accumulating carbon in the forest, and then you're also accumulating the carbon that you're using in buildings and in other products. Trillion Trees came from an idea sparked by a research paper that was presented at the World Economic Forum that said if we planted 1 trillion trees globally, that we would reduce 205 gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere. Nothing even comes anywhere close to that much scale on addressing carbon in the atmosphere. And we want to do our part here in the U.S. Of the 3 trillion trees on Earth. Currently, there's about 300 billion in the U.S. But it's something that could be done through private-public partnerships. People, I think, would line up to sponsor tree planting activities. I've talked to conservation organizations, Ducks Unlimited being one of them. They have thousands and thousands of acres of wetlands that at one time were flooded timber wetlands, like where some of the best duck hunting is in the world in Arkansas. Creates fantastic habitat. You could plant wetlands, you could plant in urban areas, you could plant in mine reclamation. We've got forest on or barren sites in the Forest Service where we've had these catastrophic wildfires that have been unable to naturally regenerate. We could plant a lot of trees in the US, but this would need to be a global effort. And we could use government resources as well as private partnerships to plant trees, not only here in the US, but also to help people around the world to plant trees and to stop deforestation and to take care of the forests that we have. We could actually have a bigger impact if we were to take care of the forests that we have here growing now and be better stewards of those than we could by planting all the trees, at least here in the United States. So the bill looks at planting trees, but it looks at a lot more than planting trees. And it also has a component on sustainable buildings that would incentivize building buildings in a way that they require less carbon emissions to build them, less carbon emissions to maintain and operate them, and storing more carbon in that building over its lifespan. So it not only is an attempt to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, it's also an attempt to reduce carbon emissions by the building practices. And it's all incentivized. It's not a regulatory penalty. It does implore market forces to make these things happen. You can't regulate an environmental utopia. You've got to get people on board and make broad scale changes that are good, again, for the environment and the economy. And that's in a nutshell what Trillion Trees aims to do. And I know I've talked a lot about it.
Oh, that's great. This is fascinating. And there's a couple of comment or reactions that the left tends to make on this. One is they say, well, trees are great, and your insight and point on trees being a protagonist throughout history and literature, very, very insightful point there. Very true. But the left sometimes says, well, it's not enough. We need to immediately stop fossil fuel emissions. Maybe you could put it in sort of a context and a scale where you talk about 200 gigatons. That's a significant percentage of the CO2 that we emit that's currently in the atmosphere.
It's estimated to be two-thirds of the carbon emitted from human activity since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's a large amount of carbon, and scientists estimate that there's been as many as 7 trillion trees on the earth. And we're around 3 trillion trees now. So we've got a lot of space where we could plant more trees if we wanted to do even more than 1 trillion. But I tell those antagonists to tell me anything if it even becomes anywhere close to reducing carbon in the atmosphere as much as a healthy forest does. And when you look at there's a lot of technology on carbon capture and storage. The volume of carbon that you're going to capture and store and the cost that it takes to do that is not even anywhere on the same order of magnitude as what you can do with a forest that's out there every day, just growing and storing that carbon. In my home state of Arkansas, we have a very robust forest products industry. The data there shows that last year, the forest of Arkansas grew 44 million tons of new wood. The forest products industry harvested 20 million tons and supported a multi-billion-dollar industry, lots of jobs in rural areas. So the net growth, the forest added 24 million tons of wood while you supported a big industry that's also putting lumber in buildings that's being sequestered for a long time. Walmart's building their new corporate headquarters out of locally grown mass timber, and they're going to be storing about 17 million pounds of carbon in their new corporate headquarters. So you really get a win-win when you talk about healthy forest and tying that with ways to use it in the economy to make rural economy strong and to make buildings more carbon friendly.
Right, and as I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents, the price of wood continues to go up, which has a ripple effect throughout the economy. And inflation, as you know, is at a 40-year high. So it seems like anything we could do to increase the supply of wood in a sustainable way just makes economic sense on many, many levels here.
Yeah, we could grow a lot more wood in Arkansas. The thing I think people miss, and this is true not just in Arkansas, it's everywhere. When you thin a forest, it grows very rapidly. When a forest closes the growing space, you get competition for minerals and nutrients and water and sunlight. It just stops growing, and it actually starts going the other way, and that's when it's subject to catastrophic wildfire through disease and insect infestations. But if you keep these forests working, they grow at much higher rates than what they're even growing right now. It's like we've got a throttle on the forest, and we don't have enough processing capacity to harvest as many trees as need to be harvested. And young trees grow much faster than older trees. It's a biological growth curve, just like a baby versus an elderly person. The baby's growing at a very high rate. So we just have to use the tools that we've got. And a whole other part of the Trillion Trees Act and another bill, the Resilient Federal Forest Act, is the biochar component, another product that can be used to make soils more productive, utilize scarce water resources better. A lot more stuff to talk about than we probably got time to talk about.
Yeah. No, we've got a couple more minutes, but I just before we move off the Trillion Tree Initiative, I think it's important because a lot of what makes headlines, obviously, are the wildfires out west, and you've addressed this some, but I think it's important for viewers to understand that a big part of the reason why we've seen these fires, it isn't just climate change, warmer temperatures, that's part of it, but also it's a lack of forest management practices where there's a lot of dead growth and just dead material, tender combustible material within the forest themselves. Is that an accurate understanding of what the
absolutely? And the poster child example for that, we're working on it right now. There's not, you kind of have to dig in the news stories to see this, but we've witnessed a huge tragedy out in California on top of the millions of acres that have burned. Included in that are part of the 37,000 acres of the only groves of giant sequoia on the planet. Looks like the numbers are gonna pan out that we lost about 20% of our giant sequoias this past year. And the giant sequoia is a tree that should never be killed by fire. And what's happened, if you look over the centuries, there would average about 30 fires per century for many centuries going back, up until the 19th century when we started suppressing fire and we only got around 2 fires per century. And you had the white fir trees that grow in the shade, they're called shade tolerant. They grew up, would normally have been knocked back by fire. They got tall enough that they got into the lower crowns of the sequoias. We had these wildfires come through, and you got crown fires in giant sequoias and literally killed whole groves of giant sequoias, which is a tragedy. I've actually been able to get some bipartisan support on what can we do to protect these giant sequoia groves. We're going to be coming out with legislation very soon. But if people can't get the concept of how important it is to use management on the 80 million acres that are subject to catastrophic wildfire, maybe they can get it on the small area of giant sequoias that, again, should never be lost to fire.
Right.
Made for fire. The bark on some of those trees is 2 feet thick.
Yeah, it's incredible. It is tragic, and do keep us posted on that legislation, and we'll certainly be tracking that. But one other question I want to ask you too is, I don't know, have you had a chance to see the movie Don't Look Up? There's a big discussion on Netflix about
I've
this.
heard about it. I haven't seen it. One thing in this job, I don't get a lot of time to watch movies, but I know it's like it's metaphorically, this
right.
asteroid is like climate change, and the scientists are warning everybody, and nobody will listen to them. I know about it, but I haven't actually seen the movie yet.
Well, yeah. The basic argument is they use a comet as an analogy for climate change, and I think part of my response to that as a conservative is, look, if you really believe climate change is like a comet, then we could launch the ship to divert that pretty quickly, and it's a multiple step solution. It's trillion tree initiative. You could do things like nuclear energy. But one of the things that's really fascinating and maddening to me is that the left wants to do things like, let's have universal preschool or single payer government run healthcare. And they link these unrelated issues to climate change. And that's a diversion. So I think we have an opportunity as conservatives to say, look, there's no climate scientist who is saying we need to have government run healthcare in order to address climate change.
Yeah, climate change is being used as the tool to pass a lot of a socialist agenda, and that's unfortunate, because if we wanted to address carbon in the atmosphere, which climate change all comes to carbon in the atmosphere, it's 100% about how much greenhouse gas, how much carbon's in the atmosphere. Again, go back to forest. There's nothing that takes carbon out of the atmosphere like a tree does. And I apologize, John, but my staff tell me I've got just a little bit of time left in a vote. Okay. So I'm have to wrap.
Well, I'll let you get to you. That's an important job is to cast votes. So, Congressman, thank you so much for your time, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation on this and a lot of other issues. So, this has been the Right Voices interview series with Congressman Bruce Westerman. I'm John Hart, and please follow us at c3newsmagazine.com. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you.